There's a lot going on in the rainforest. Vines creep up trees while tree roots snake across the forest floor. But high above the action on the ground, there's a war being waged between mushrooms and ants. Some, like Cordyceps curvifer, go straight for the jugular, killing their hosts almost immediately, so that the only sign of infection is a strange odor emanating from their corpses. Secondary metabolites are chemical compounds that aren't essential for basic functions like growth or metabolism. Instead, they usually serve to protect the organism that produces them against predators or competing organisms. It compels the ant to climb up its favorite blade of grass or leaf, lock its jaw in a death grip, and die. But don't worry, we've got plenty of our own terrifying brain parasites to deal with. Click here to learn about the parasitic worm that makes ants build bigger, better nests for it to lay its eggs in, or click here to watch this other video instead. Then, true to its name, the fungus explodes out of the back of the dead ant's head, transforming the once living creature into a terrifying fruiting body, releasing even more spores into the world, starting the zombification process all over again. So while Corpus species differ in what these chemical weapons actually are, their general function is always the same: to attack the ant's nervous system and make it easier for the fungus to take over. But how exactly do these chemicals control the ants? Well, thanks to advances in DNA sequencing, we know that the genes responsible for making them are located on special pieces of DNA called plasmids. These circular strands of genetic material exist separately from the main chromosomes in the nucleus of a cell, allowing genes to be passed between members of the same species through a process called conjugation. Basically, one bacterium extends a tube called a conjugal bridge connecting it to another bacterium and transfers its plasmid through it. The recipient bacterium then incorporates the new plasmid into its genome, acquiring any beneficial traits the plasmid might confer, including the ability to make powerful neurotropic chemicals. And that is important because corpus parasites have to pass these plasmids along to each other whenever they infect a new host. If they didn't, the new host wouldn't be affected. And if that happened, it would mean that the parasite couldn't complete its life cycle. Luckily for the fungus, it turns out that not only can plasmids be transferred between members of the same species, but different species can exchange them too. So the corpus fungus benefits from a sort of community plasmid bank, constantly sharing genetic material and strengthening their collective arsenal of neurotropic weapons. Other types, like Cordyceps unilateralis, take a slower approach, turning their victims into what scientists call fruiting bodies, which release even more zombifying spores and continue the freaky cycle of infection and mind control. Well, it depends on the species of corpus. Some, like Cordyceps australis, produce compounds that act like narcotics, slowing down the ant's central nervous system until it falls into a slumber, at which point the corpus can take full control. Others, like Cordyceps longistromata, release acids that break down the ant's exoskeletons, making it easier for the fungus to spread throughout their body. And yet others, like Cordyceps sinensis, produce alkaloids that cause the ants to act erratically, wandering away from their colony mates and climbing up tall blades of grass or leaves, where they'll clamp down in their death grip and die. But maybe the strangest of all is Cordyceps unilateralis, which instead of simply shutting down the ant's brain, seems to take over their personality. Infected ants become hyperactive, biting and stinging any ants that get too close, and they act aggressively toward anything they perceive as a threat to their colony. And it's not just ants. This hyper-aggressive behavior has been observed in other insects infected by corpus parasites, too. Researchers think that this behavior might be a defense mechanism, helping to prevent the spread of the fungus by killing anyone who comes into contact with an infected individual. But why would the fungus program the ants to be so aggressive? Well, remember, the fungus needs the ant to stay alive for as long as possible. And one way to do that is to protect the infected individual from other members of its own colony, who might try to kill it once they notice that something's wrong. By turning the ants into angry, biting monsters, the fungus prevents other ants from trying to stop it from spreading. But regardless of the species, every case of ant zombification starts in the same way. As with any parasitic relationship, the goal of the corpus fungus is to take advantage of its host's body and behavior to help itself survive and reproduce. So as soon as spores from the fungus come into contact with an ant, they secrete digestive acids which melt through the ant's exoskeleton, dissolving their protective outer shell and letting the fungus sneak inside. There, it sets up shop in the ant's hemicle, which is the insect equivalent of blood. From there, the fungus begins to grow, sending out thread-like structures called stromata throughout the rest of the ant's body. And as the stroma spread, they begin to do damage, slowly eating away at the ant's vital internal organs. But here's the thing. The corpus fungus doesn't want to kill the ant right away because it needs the ant's body to keep it alive long enough for it to grow and reproduce. So instead, the fungus essentially plays house guest, staying quiet and lying low until it's ready to start taking over. That usually takes a couple of days, after which point the stroma have fully taken over the ant's hemicle, preventing the blood from carrying oxygen throughout the body. This means that the ant's energy levels drop significantly, which in turn affects its behavior. After all, the ant brain requires lots of energy to function properly. So as the fungus slowly deprives the brain of nutrients, the colony may begin to act erratically. At first, the change isn't drastic. The infected ant might appear sluggish or less responsive to its surroundings. But as the fungus takes over more and more of the ant's nervous system, its behavior becomes more pronounced. Eventually, the corpus fungus completely takes over the ant's brain, turning it into a mindless puppet that does whatever the fungus wants. But before we get to the zombification part of this process, let's talk about how the corpus fungus is able to control the ants in the first place. And no, not those cute little leafcutter ants. We're talking about carpenter ants, who are many times larger and live in massive colonies that stretch as far as the eye can see. These ants are especially vulnerable to a tiny parasitic fungus called Cordyceps, and the way this fungus kills is genuinely terrifying. As some species of Cordyceps slowly take over their hosts, they compel the ants to act natural, tricking their colony mates into thinking everything's alright. But as the fungus slowly starts to take over more and more of the ant's body, its behavior becomes more and more erratic until finally, once the fungus is ready to reproduce, the ant does something entirely unexpected. It crawls up a leaf or blade of grass and locks its jaw in a death grip, holding itself up like a tripod as a fruiting body, also known as the stromata, sprouts from the back of its dead head, and begins sprinkling the forest floor and ants' colony mates below with even more zombifying spores. Yeah, if that sounds like a scene straight out of a horror movie, you're not alone. But there's a lot more to this horrifying process than meets the eye. How exactly does the corpus fungus turn ants into zombies? What other terrifying tricks do they have up their microscopic sleeves? And could they even infect us humans? Let's find out. When it comes to infecting ants, not all corpus species follow the same exact strategy. Though the exact mechanism varies depending on the species, it is generally agreed that the corpus fungus produces small molecules called secondary metabolites that influence the ant's central nervous system. But what do these weapons actually do to the ants? But once the corpus fungus is ready to reproduce, it stops caring about keeping the ants alive. Now, thankfully, it doesn't seem like corpus parasites are capable of infecting humans.